Good afternoon, people in person. It's awesome. It's been a long time since we had, well, last time we had people in person, I think it was just you and maybe two other people. It was a little while ago. Thanks for coming today. I really appreciate you being here. And we are going to be talking today about the history of Temple City. Before we do that, we want to acknowledge the original people who were here. And to just remember that even though the families were here for roughly 90 years, there were people here for maybe 100 times that, or whatever it was. And that we're acknowledging that we're part of the ancestral, traditional, unceded lands of the native people. And recognizing that they were the traditional stewards, and we're paying respect to them and their ancestors. And we try to recognize the connection they had culturally and spiritually to this place. As a part of Hawaiian, I in particular have a strong view about that. So always want to make sure that we do that. All right, and what we're talking about today is what was initially conceived as a memorial to the pioneer temple family. When we say the word pioneer, it has a lot of connotations to it. And we'll talk about some of that as we go through as well. The early history we're dealing with here from the start of the community in 1923 until the end of the 1920s. And that's the end of our time period. It was also the end of Walter Temple's involvement in the community. So hopefully you'll enjoy this excursion through a little bit of our local history. And as we talked about just a moment ago, we have to remember that there were folks here before. On the left there is a photograph from the 1870s, early 1870s, of a quiche or a house on the Rancho San Gabriel. So very, very close to Temple City in Arcadia. And so we'll mention that too. And there were many tribal villages. The Gabrielino name was, of course, bestowed upon the native peoples by the missionaries, Spanish missionaries. But these villages were quite numerous. So you see San Gabriel perhaps here in the upper middle below that is Siba or Sibagna, Savannah. Apparently maybe a term that comes out of that, even though there were a lot of Southern Americans who came to this area in the 1850s. And there's a Savannah cemetery that is very close to where that village was located. We are out here between the EML and Awigna here at La Puente. That village was either behind the cemetery on our site or over in La Puente at the City Park, City Hall. Probably both, probably more places. If you get flooding from the creek nearby, you move to the village and that sort of thing. But again, there was a large population of native peoples, especially around the rivers and the creeks. So you've got a lot of the creeks coming down from the San Gabriel Mountains and going into the Whittier Narrows. And so where Temple City is located, you would have a lot of activity from the native people out there. The San Gabriel mission was started in the Whittier Narrows. A lot of people don't know that in 1771. It didn't move to its current location until several years after that. And I mention that because Walter P. Temple, who founded Temple City, put up a plaque or a monument to the original site of the San Gabriel mission at Whittier Narrows back in 1921. And the family was very connected to the mission. A lot of their sacraments were out there and what have you. And so there were a lot of reasons why he had an interest in developing himself in different towns in the San Gabriel Valley as part of his background. These are 1870s photographs, including one where you can see in the foreground at the bottom there, railroad tracks. And so when those got lowered recently as part of the transportation developments, they found a huge amount of material, archaeological stuff, from the native people forward. So kind of a neat thing. You don't often see this view, by the way, looking this direction. You usually see the one on the left there. Now, as the mission was secularized, meaning it was basically shut down by the Mexican government in the 1830s, a lot of the land that the missions controlled were made available for private settlement. The missions were supposed to be only around for 10 years. That was what they originally thought. It would take 10 years to civilize, so-called, and Christianize the natives, and then turn them into Spanish citizens and farmers, and voila, everything would be perfect. And 65 years later, things hadn't really gotten where they wanted to. So the decision was made to be able to create these private ranchos. A lot of the settlers in the Spanish and Mexican period of California were soldiers who were brought up from Mexico, and they were told, do your hitch, and then when you're done, you'll have land. And they weren't getting the land that they thought they were going to because the missions were still controlling a lot of this. But finally in the 1830s that happened. Rancho San Francisquito is the one that encompasses much of Temple City. So on the left is a map of the rancho from that period. On the far left there, you can see a straight line going from top to bottom. That's Encinita Avenue, if you know Temple City. Not too far from Rosemead Boulevard. So the western part of the rancho is where Temple City was located. On the right is the San Gabriel River. On the bottom is the curvy line, that's Valley Boulevard. And so that was, in the middle says Town of Lexington, and that was another southern name bestowed upon what became Alani. The very bottom left corner of the rancho, I can walk over, I guess and point it out, right here, it says cemetery, it says graveyard. And that's the Savannah Cemetery that's still with us today. The grantee of San Francisquito was Henry Dalton, who was an Englishman. He was in South America for a period of time, and then in Mexico. Wound up here in the 1840s. He was able to obtain a number of ranchos, including Azusa and Santa Anita, which is to the north and the west of San Francisquito, which he also obtained. So he had quite a bit of a little empire out here from the 1840s onwards. He had a lot of financial and legal problems of various sorts. But one thing he was able to do was to pursue a land claim which the American government required of all the Spanish and Mexican ranchos. And he was able to get his map approved and his patents in the 1860s. After about 16 years that they went through courts and commissions. That was actually an average for that time. We're doing all of that. Now, Dalton had a daughter who married a young man named Louis Wolfskill. And the Wolfskill family had been around in California for quite a long time, meaning his father, William Wolfskill, who was a Kentucky native and came out here back in the 1830s. And Wolfskill's mother was a member of the Lugo family, a very prominent California family from the early Spanish period. And Louis Wolfskill, being the newly minted son-in-law, saw that his father-in-law was in trouble financially. Dalton had a lot of issues. And so one of the things that Wolfskill did was to promise his father-in-law he would help him raise money. And Henry Dalton then turned over the western two-thirds of this rancho to his son-in-law. And so we'll try to introduce some of that too. So there's Louis Wolfskill on the top left corner. He is one of the many mixed people, American and California, of that era. He was a member of the Los Angeles Common Council, or City Council, during the time we're talking about, which is the middle 1870s. And he brought in two partners on this western two-thirds of the rancho. Next to him is F.P.F. Temple, who was a prominent rancher and farmer, also a business person and banker. His brother had come to California, to Los Angeles in the 1820s. And then Temple's father-in-law on the bottom left, a happy-looking gentleman there, William Workman, who lived at this site and established our first house here. And so the three of them went in together on owning this western two-thirds part of the rancho. And because there was a boom going on, and by boom, it wasn't like you'd see in the 1880s or the 1920s where it was a lot of people, but Los Angeles was growing for the first time after the Civil War period for about 7 or 8 years. And Temple and Workman were very interested in that. They had a bank in Los Angeles, for example, and many different enterprises they were engaged in. So my thought was the three of them got together on this because they could see that there might be opportunities to subdivide and maybe create a town out there. That didn't wind up happening. The main reason was because the Temple and Workman Bank got into financial problems. There was an economic panic, and when depositors came looking for their money, there wasn't enough cash in the vaults to be able to pay depositors. And so the bank was in a bit of trouble. It had to close down in September 1875, and about a month later, Wolfskill, Temple, and Workman raised cash by selling the western two-thirds of Rancho San Francisquito to a guy named Lucky Baldwin. So you've seen the name Baldwin Avenue on Arcadia, Baldwin Hills in Los Angeles, all owned by, or much of it owned by the Workmans and Temples and Southern Grade Wolfskill. Baldwin was lucky because there was a silver mine stock bubble in Nevada. If anybody's been to Virginia City, which is a really cool place to visit, there was a big activity in the Comstock low, but silver stock got too high, and Baldwin was going on a trip, and he decided to sell his stock. He told his agent, when he gets to a certain price, sell it. The problem was he took the key to his strong box with him when he went on vacation, and he couldn't sell. But when he got back, the price went even higher than he instructed the sale price to be, a lot higher, and then he sold. And some reports said that he made around $8 million at that time from selling the stock. But when he did that, guess what happened to everybody else? They panicked, and then the whole thing collapsed. So he got out with $8 million, and there was a major panic, and it started in San Francisco. The state's biggest bank went under, and then the news came down to Los Angeles, and these guys, Workman and Temple, had a lot of depositors' money, and it didn't happen. So part of the solution for them was to sell that part of San Francisquito to Baldwin. This is a copy of the receipt that Temple and Workman issued to Wolfskill for their share of the sale, $11,200, which was not going to solve their banking problem. It was just one little piece that they were going to do. What Temple and Workman wound up doing was borrowing money from Baldwin, about $350,000 shortly afterwards, and that didn't solve their problems either. The bank failed, Baldwin foreclosed, and these guys were wiped out. Wolfskill didn't have much of a long life either. He wound up dying quite young in the 1880s. So Baldwin comes onto the scene. There's on the left there is a copy of the deed for the sale of the Rancho, and there's an image of Baldwin in the 1880s newspaper. He was a controversial figure, to say the least. I hesitate to try to find an example from today. There probably are many of them. He was a philanderer. He had a penchant for young girlfriends and wives. One of them shot him in a courtroom during a legal battle. He was ruthless, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the Gilded Age. This is capitalism at its finest in the minds of a lot of people. But he was a very successful individual for most of his life. He had some ups and downs. But he becomes the owner of San Francisquito. And over the last part of the 19th century and until his death in 1909, he periodically would try to lease out some of the property, might occasionally sell things. A great advertisement from a newspaper in the 1880s, focusing mainly on Arcadia and the Rancho San Gabriel, and every place is California's choicest locality, right? And they're all going to advertise that. But this was a place that had a lot of potential. It's just that people weren't quite ready to move east of Pasadena just yet, as he was starting to do this stuff in the later part of the 19th century. When Baldwin died in 1909, his estate was valued at about $11 million, which was a pretty substantial estate. There were estimates of $25 million on the part of some people. But he left quite a bit of property to his two daughters. He had two heirs that were left. All right, so it's basically still ranching and farming out there for quite a long time. As you get into the early 20th century and things start to change dramatically, and you get to the early 1920s, Los Angeles is now on par with a lot of the cities back east. Population was roughly 10,000 in 1880, around the time that Baldwin came on the scene. And by 1920, you've got about 600,000 people in Los Angeles. You have about 1 million by 1930. So there's a lot going on. You can see that the city's expanding, but it happens out in the hinterlands too. So people start thinking suburban growth may be happening in a big way. San Fernando Valley, for example, which was kind of a wasteland. There wasn't a lot of water out there. You could dry farm wheat, but as far as settlement goes, not till the LA Aqueduct was built. And then suddenly you had the ability to be able to develop more out there. And in the San Gabriel Valley, there was a gradual movement. Alhambra, for example, was a really rapidly growing community at that time. It was also closer to Los Angeles. So the further you get out, the less likely you're going to see development be successful. I'm emphasizing that point for a particular reason when it comes to Temple City. Now, there was a guy named Joseph Burkhard who was a major investor throughout Los Angeles, the Harbor District, West LA, many places. He was a native of Germany, came out to America, kind of a story that gets passed around as the American dream realized, all that sort of thing. Not that a lot of people were able to do this, but he certainly was. And he had a lot of property, and he was able to buy land east of Alhambra, east of San Gabriel. He had about 700 acres at one point, and he decided he was going to build a town out there on this property. So a couple of articles in 1921 talking about, maybe 22, talking about his ideas out in this location. And for a while, he actually advertised Sunny Slope Acres as a new town that was going to pop up. You can see ads, usual things you talk about in areas that are kind of country and close to cities, so you can have your fresh vegetables, eggs, fruit, and milk on your own little small farm. The small farm thing was huge back then. San Fernando Valley had a lot of these too, where you raise chickens and all of that, and be able to make enough money to live on. Rear your children in a wholesome atmosphere. Well, who wouldn't want that? And save rent and taxes and what have you. A half acre, $950, an acre for $2,500. Sounds pretty good. But it didn't get realized. And so Sunny Slope Acres kind of went by the wayside. And what Burkhard wound up doing was selling a little bit of that property, roughly half, to Walter P. Temple. So Walter is a son of the FPF temple I mentioned before, and a grandson of William Workman, who lives here. Walter was 6 years old when his family bank collapsed in the 1870s. He did not grow up with very much money at all. The family had a 50-acre homestead, they called it, in the Whittier Narrows, very close to the San Gabriel and the Rio Hondo. And Walter, through a friend of his from El Monte named Milton Kaufman, was starting to look at buying some property near this homestead because there was an oil belt that they imagined existed. So a large oil field was found by a guy named Edward Doheny, that you might have heard of, in Los Angeles, just west of downtown. And then in Whittier, they found oil in the early 20th century. So their thought was, between Los Angeles and Whittier, there might be some possibilities in the Montebello Hills. And you can see around this scene on the right, it's bare ground. There wasn't trees and a lot of luxurious growth. It was kind of a rough patch of ground there. That land had been owned by Walter's father before the bank failure and went to Lucky Baldwin. Because when Baldwin loaned the bank money, they used their land as collateral, right? And so the Baldwin heirs still own that in 1912. When Walter goes to the executor of the estate, a guy named Unruh, and says, I'd like to buy some of the land around these hills there. And apparently he didn't have the cash to buy it outright, so they made a financing deal, which I thought was kind of interesting. I don't think they felt sorry for him because his family had lost all this land before, and now he's asking for a little bit of it. And maybe Unruh thought, it's just bare hills, what kind of value could there be over there, right? 1912. So Walter's able to buy this acreage. He moves his family to an adobe house at the base of the hill. And in the spring of 1914, it's raining. It's April. And the rainwater goes down, and something comes to the surface. Walter's 9-year-old son is on that hillside playing around with some friends, and he smells something. Rotten egg smell. You know what that is, right?
Yeah.
Well, remember the show in the 60s? Beverly Hillbillies?
Texas tea.
Yeah, we call these guys the Montebello Hillbillies, just jokingly. But it's kind of like that. This little kid is out playing around and he happens to find oil out there. And so Standard Oil, now Chevron, comes along in 1915 on a lease. They drilled on the Baldwin side first, and they were successful in bringing oil in. And just a couple hundred yards away, they drilled Temple Oil Well number 1. And in June 1917, that happens. I don't know if that's the exact well, but it's on the property there. And so suddenly they have a gusher, and the family goes from having almost no money to being quite wealthy very, very quickly at the end of the 1910s. Now Walter takes the proceeds from this, and he does two things primarily. One is to get in his own oil prospecting business. He tries oil wells in Mexico, Alaska, Texas, Long Beach, Huntington Beach, Ventura. He's all over the place trying things out. And as a small player, you know, you're not like Standard Oil or Shell or Texaco, and you're not even like Getty, who at that time was kind of a middle-level player. And so he had a hard time making money through the oil side of it. He was sometimes successful, more often than not. And then the second thing he did was real estate. Both of those are speculative, right? You're investing a lot of money up front, and you're hoping that you're going to be able to be successful with it. And because the post-World War I era and into the early 1920s is a big boom period in Los Angeles, there's that fever. And when you catch it, who knows what you're going to wind up doing. So I'm going to give you a few examples of what he was doing within 3 years, roughly. In Alhambra, where he had moved his family after the oil money came, he owned about a block and a half of downtown on Main Street between 3rd and 5th, if you know that area at all, on the north side. And he built a movie theater on the top left there. That was his first project, opened at the end of 1921. Shortly afterwards, he built a mortuary next door, and he followed that with other projects. So that was one area. Another was in El Monte, which is a town he was very familiar with. He grew up very close to it. His business manager, Milton Kaufman, the family had a store there for many years in that community. And so they built a movie theater and a post office building in El Monte. This is 1922-23.
So they would own the post office and lease it back?
They would own the building and lease the quarters out to the post office. He did that in 3 places because it seemed like a safe thing to do.
Yes.
You have a rental that's...
Totally comfortable.
Yeah. It was a good idea. I think it's just a question of how compressed the time frame you're trying to do all this stuff, right? And then in San Gabriel, which I mentioned before, the temples were very tied into the mission. Personally, from having sacraments there and what have you, but also romantically, meaning that they had this vision of California history as reflected through the missions. They were very supportive of that. You may or may not have heard of the mission play, which was very popular for about 20 years. 2 million people saw it, evidently, in 20 years. It was a very romantic picture of the Spanish missionaries and their heroic work trying to save the benighted souls of the native peoples. We wouldn't do that today, but it was something that Walter Temple supported very much. And across the mission, he bought the entire block that's just right across a little bit to the west of the mission. So he built a post office and a city library and a real estate office in that building on the top. That's still there. And then to the left of that, along Mission Drive, he built a 2-story building and 5 stores. And then at the end of that block, he donated the lot for what is still San Gabriel City Hall today. And he had his architects, guys named Walker and Isaac from Los Angeles, design all of this stuff. So another example, again, 1922-23. In Los Angeles, he joined a syndicate of investors, including his business manager, Kaufman, his attorney, a guy named George Woodruff, the architects, who I just mentioned, Walker and Isaac, and a guy named Otis Birch. There's a Birch Street in Santa Ana, and Birch was an oil investor in Brea Canyon, made a huge amount of money, and became quite successful. Owned a furniture business as well in Los Angeles. And so these guys together bought property in Los Angeles on Spring and 8th Streets. And on the north side, they built the building on the left there, the Big Republic Life building. And on the south side, they and other investors built the National City Bank building on the south side. 1923-24. So you can see in 4 places, within just a few years, all of these things were going on. And there was actually more than just that. I just want to give you some of the main highlights of that. So a lot of money is being expended very quickly on these projects. Yes?
Sterling has a question.
Did Walter, who took, which one of his sons took over after he died?
We'll get into that. I'll talk about that at the end,
Okay.
because there was nothing to take over. But one of his sons became a very prominent historian and genealogist over in San Gabriel.
Yeah,
So if you think of Thomas Temple, that would be him.
Okay, that's my cousin.
Okay, good. Thanks for coming in. So just to put some faces to the names. On the top left there is Walter Temple on the right, his attorney in the middle, George Woodruff, and on the left, his business manager, Wilhelm Kaufman. They're standing at the south porch of the Workman house. So if you're going to go on a tour of the site someday, you'll be probably walking by, you'll see where that location is. On the right is Woodruff, Temple, and another investor in Temple City, Sylvester Dupuy, who obviously had French ancestry. Dupuy was a sheep rancher. He had a lot of acreage around Cal State, LA, and the southwestern part of Alhambra, a place called the Rancho San Francisquito. And Dupuy built a French chateau mansion on a hill in Alhambra. That's on the bottom there. Some of you might remember the tragedy involving the music producer Phil Spector.
Mm-hmm.
That happened in that house.
Okay.
And so it's still standing. Not sure who owns it. I think maybe Spector's divorced wife still had it. Of course, he died not that long ago. But in any case, kind of an interesting little tidbit. But these are the guys, the 4 of them, who really were the core of the Temple City project. So Walter and his partners buy 285 acres from the Burkhard investment company in early 1923. About the middle of May, they announced in the Pasadena newspaper this new community. Town of Temple was the official name from 1923 for several years. And the plan was to open on the 1st of July. That never is realized. Everybody says we're going to open on the next day. You have to double it.
Yeah.
Typically, just somebody announced it's going to cost X amount, double it, that kind of thing. But one of the big things they were promoting from the beginning was the Pacific Electric Railway was going to expand its line from Alhambra out to this new community. And the thought was that's really going to make things successful. People are going to want to live near rapid transit. And it's funny how we're trying to go back and recreate some of that today. But in any case, that was a big selling point for them. They formed the Temple Townsite Company. So the Historical Society in Temple City owns the original minute book for the company. Unfortunately, 3 years are missing, from which makes you wonder why 3 years are missing. But in any case, on the left is the organizational document. On the right is the opening meeting of the Townsite Company. This is May 1923. So we're in the centennial year Temple City, and so they would be kind of the date, I guess, to say that's when the things got really rolling. There were 5 directors because you had to have 5. So it was Temple, Dupuy, Kaufman, Woodruff, and Dolores Bingham. You think, wow, a woman who had an involvement in the company. She was a stenographer for Woodruff. She was given 1 share of stock. And she would show up to the meetings. She was basically a straw investor, is what a term would put it. She didn't really have a role in it. The other 4 guys did. So, yeah, I was surprised to see that years ago. Wow, I thought I'd do some research and find something. There wasn't much there, unfortunately. For most women, there wasn't much they were allowed to do. But as they promoted this, one of the things that was talked about is in the LA Times article on the left, towards the bottom, the town was built as a memorial to the pioneer Temple family, which came to Los Angeles a century ago, and has been prominently identified with the development of the Southwest. That's a bit excessive. That's a big area. They were, kind of big in LA, on and off for quite a number of years. But it's almost like Walter Temple was going back whatever he could to try to reestablish his family name. So when I talked to her earlier and showed you the photographs of those buildings in Los Angeles, Spring Street, this is 8 blocks from the Temple block, which his father and his father and uncle had built in the 1800s, and was still stood until just after these buildings were built, and LA needed a new city hall. So they leveled the Temple block and put City Hall there. But I think he thought Spring Street's great because right near where my father and grandfather were. And of course, when he gets involved in Temple City, his father and grandfather had the part investment in that land back in the 1870s until Baldwin got a hold of it. So again, it's like he's trying to identify locations where he can reestablish the family name. All right, so it's time to start promoting. So here's an early ad from the Pasadena newspaper that they're going to spend $350,000, which doesn't sound like a lot of money now, but I guess back then it was a fair amount for a small little town. 40 houses are ready to be built. Study the map, how to get out there, and again, they're promoting the idea of the Pacific Electric being built out there. Marsh and Corrin, I want to just mention that briefly because they're going to come back into the picture towards the end of the presentation. They were the official agents, but there were other people, as you can see at the bottom, hopefully, local agents in Alhambra, San Gabriel, and so forth, Monterey Park, who were going to be able to sell property in town there. Love that billboard. Town of Temple, see it build, there's an arrow, so this is obviously towards the south, pointing their way up. I'm assuming that's Temple City Boulevard out there, and then you see the San Gabriel looming majestically in the background, 1923. A lot of these photos came from the Historical Society of Temple City as well. And then when they promoted in things like pamphlets and brochures, you can get the usual things. It's an ideal location, it's got great transportation, the surroundings are fantastic. They've got a bank, and you can see the downtown and all of that as well. That access to the train was realized in 1924. So the little station there with the Spanish-style roof, that's where City Hall is in Temple City today. And you can see little tiny trees just planted in the city park, right next door to that. And that building stood until about 1942, so it lasted all of about 18 years. Because even in 1924, when this was finished, the streetcar was already having trouble. Because there were so many cars coming in and people were falling in love with their vehicles and all of that. So it probably didn't do what they said it was going to do in the ads, but that's what advertisements do, right? They promise you things and then you see if they get realized. I'm not saying it never got used or what have you, but it probably wasn't the game buster effect that they were hoping it would be. That building still stands. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, I think all 4 buildings on the corner, Temple City Boulevard and Las Tunas, are standing today. The pharmacy, there was a pharmacy there, I think until the 90s maybe, something like that in that building.
They're still all there.
Yeah, all 4 buildings are still there. Yeah. Slightly modified,
Yes.
but yes, still there. You can see the hardware store on the left, so kind of a neat photograph of the early part of town. You don't have to go too far to find barren lots, and I want to emphasize that point as well. Another neat photo from, I think, maybe 1926, so you're just a little bit to the south on Temple City Boulevard, which is called Sunset Avenue in those days, looking at the north. So the bank building on the right, you see a little bit of the pharmacy on the left there. So there are a few of these photographs floating around.
How many banks did they have opening up?
In town, just the one.
Just the one?
Yeah. It was small enough that that's really all it could support. And sometimes what they would do is open these banks hoping that it would be a lure to people. Like, oh, if you've got a bank, that means you got a real town. It doesn't mean the bank's going to be successful in the long term, but that was kind of the idea. They did the same thing in San Gabriel, opened a bank pretty quickly during the 20s to try to lure people to come in. This is a great little map by Douglas Corrin, who was the original agent for Temple and his associates, and continued to sell property much later after Temple went by the wayside. But you can see Las Piñas in the middle, Sunset, or now Temple City Boulevard, because Camellia was called Temple. So they had to change the name of Camellia too. Temple and Camellia to kind of accommodate that. And you see the names Workman and Kaufman and Woodruff's in there somewhere. There is Woodruff up here. And Agnes was the only daughter of Walter Temple. His 3 sons didn't get a street, but his daughter did. In any case, Baldwin on the end there was already an existing street. And then, like I said, Ensenada, which is misspelled here, was the western boundary of the Rancho San Francisquito and the western boundary of Temple City at that point. This was the whole thing, but of course they expanded as cities tend to do over time. As far as the community goes, this is another big thing, was trying to lure a church to come down here. So this church had existed in Arcadia nearby, and they got him to move to a new building that was donated by Walter Temple. So the city park is to the left, and the library is to the left, and this got done in the 1920s. So again, if you have a nice church, you've got a school, you've got a bank, or those things you want to have this community look like it's thriving. The photos are a little rough, but there's the church on the bottom here. So you're looking to the northeast, City Park in the foreground. And on the top there is the first anniversary barbecue, where they wanted to try to get more people to come out and see the place. And so they had the free food and games and what have you. And they promised they wouldn't try to sell anything to you that day. Just show up, have a good time. We won't have any lot sales that day. And then they hope that you can come back.
What was the date of the first anniversary?
September 28th, 1924, which is interesting because maybe they started selling lots in late September. That's probably what it is, of 1923, right? Then this is the first anniversary.
There's a Camellia Parade next weekend on Saturdays.
Yeah,
It's been
right.
going for a long time.
Yeah. I don't think the Camellia Festival date was set up with this in mind.
No, it was something separate, but it's still a thing that's been going on in the city for.
Yeah, exactly. And there will be Temple descendants in that parade next weekend, so that'll be kind of fun. Speaking of parades, so another thing the community tried to do to get this name out was to have floats in the Rose Parade. This is the kind of float you would see in a Rose Parade back then, right? You wouldn't do that now because they wouldn't choose you to do that. But they promoted themselves at the heart of the San Gabriel Valley. Every town said that about themselves. Amani said we're the heart of the San Gabriel Valley. I guess pretty close. I don't know where the center actually is, probably in the riverbed. But in any case, they did this several years running when they had a float in the parade. It was a way to market the community, obviously, and had a little bit of civic pride. A couple of people to mention, R. Thornton Smith was an important figure because, not just because he had a real estate business and other things that he did in town, but he was the photographer. I don't know if anybody else took photographs that have survived other than him. Probably have, but he took quite a few of the early images that we still have, so we should thank him for that. On the left is an interesting little story. Mabel Walker's parents were ranchers in Temple City. She was an attorney, and how many women were doing that in the early 20th century? And then she became the Assistant United States Attorney General in the 1920s, under Harding and Coolidge, I think both of those. And her job was to enforce prohibition. Good luck with that, sister, right? How hard was that going to be? I thought that was kind of a cool little tidbit about Temple City history, that you had the U.S. Attorney General's parents who lived in town. And it was a woman who was the Attorney General too, or assistant. Now, there are the dark sides to this too. Almost every place in greater Los Angeles had racial restrictions. They called them restrictive covenants. Sometimes they were more covert about it than other times. This brochure from 1928 really didn't mince words at all. So if you look here on the right, only white people reside here, white people of a desirable class, which makes me wonder what that means, like no mobile homes and trailer parks? I'm not really sure what that means. Who take pride in their homes and upbuilding the community. These were everywhere, outside of Boyle Heights and South and South Central Los Angeles. And this could apply also, and did often apply to Jews. It wasn't just people of color. In other words, not just Latinos, Asians, and blacks, but also Jews. Now, I don't know if that was written into the covenants for Temple City specifically, because usually it would say Caucasian race, and then you could, I guess, have a debate about who would be involved in that. But Walter Temple is part Latino. His wife's maiden name was Gonzalez. His business manager is Milton Kaufman, a Jew, right? But that's part of the environment you're dealing with at that time. It's just the contradictions are everywhere. They're probably everywhere at any time, in almost any place when you think about it. But they were pretty upfront about it in things like this. And some of the advertising was too, as well. But those are the realities you're dealing with. Now when you look at the population of Temple City today, and lots of other places, right, you see a whole different thing. And so it's interesting just to go back and think about how life was. And how much do you judge these people for the way they thought and did? That's up for anybody individually to decide. But our goal here is to bring up these things and then let people think about what it means to them, right? That's part of understanding it. A lot of advertising, and just, sometimes it's just fun to see the money bags, right? Oh, if you put your money here, it's a great investment, things are going to be great. California's newest and most charming home community. Any town would say that in their advertisements, obviously. But they're still pretty fun to look at. One on the left, the LA Times, home, health, and wealth await you. All these things are going to happen to you if you just invest a small amount of money. The half-acre garden plots. And so when you go to Temple City and other towns today, the closer you are to downtown, the lots are 50-foot width, kind of typical. If you go just a few blocks away, they're half acres. And then you get the ADUs now, right? Yeah. The accessory dwelling units, and there's all kinds of controversy about that, street parking, but all these towns that did that, it's just interesting to see how these things kind of change over time, how they manifest themselves.
When they were planning that, they were only selling dirt, right? They were only, you go to the Marsh and Kaufman and you bought a lot. Mm-hmm. Now, you needed a house on that. Was there a connection from the Marsh and Kaufman or other promoters to say, we have a lineup of contractors, or we suggest you buy your house from?
Jim, perfect. It's a great segue, because I was going to talk about that coming up. Yeah. So Temple and his associates hired a company called McAnulty, and they were new arrivals from, I think, they were contractors. And they made a very complicated financing deal with them, and then McAnulty basically defaulted. So yes, they were going to promise you that you could buy the lot and build your own, or they would work with you to build, and on all of that. But they had that problem. This is part of the issue of starting a new town and then hoping everything falls into line the way you want to. But that was a big deal, having these contractors come in and not be able to fulfill their end of the bargain. It was a huge problem.
Well, with, you talked about Meter Narrows earlier,
Yeah.
and oil, and Baldwin Hills is the same thing. Yeah. Did they still the mineral rights along with the acres of land?
It's going to depend on place to place. I have not seen a Temple City deed to know what is on there. But yeah, that's a good question. And somebody here who knows Temple City really well may be able to answer that question. But yeah, I have not seen that myself to see. Okay, a couple of examples. There's the ad for the free barbecue and all of that. And the idea, again, of trying to sell this free car would be a big thing. Then you get into the problem. So McAnulty is one example of that. We do have a few of these in our collection that have been donated by family members. It's not a complete run. But to see these financial statements is helpful to know. What are the cash receipts coming in? What are you dispersing? That sort of thing. This is early. It's 1924, so things are still pretty good. What caught my eye was they canceled a payment of $25 to Amy Semple McPherson. If you know about her, Sister Amy was a famous evangelist. Yeah. She was a faith healer, immensely popular figure. I wonder why the company was going to give her $25. That is a strange thing. I'd love to find that out. It was canceled.
It's her centennial, the Angelus Temple.
Angelus Temple centennial this year too. That's right, 1923. Yeah. Still there today. Not too far from your needs. And then some other things started to happen. So it wasn't just the fact that the contract was having a problem. The company wasn't happy with Marsh and Corrin, the agents. And in the minutes it says, we're not selling lots fast enough. We need to do better with that. So all that advertising wasn't following through. And then they decided in 1925 to hire another realty company, Barry. And that got canceled within 6 months. And so I'm not sure exactly why, but they were having trouble with their agents and their contractors. That's not a good sign. And then this comes along. The Mattoon Act was a legislation passed by California legislature in Sacramento. Unintended consequences. So it's an ad valorem tax, meaning you assess value of property, they will determine what they will do for infrastructure development. So this goes to another point. Like, you buy the bare dirt, but you need all the infrastructure.
What is sewer power?
Sewer power, yeah, exactly. Or the highways. In fact, the Mattoon Act was really influential in building a lot of highways. So it had a good impact in that sense. The problem was, if, let's say, Jim, you own a lot and I own a lot, and then in between us is this gentleman. And he's a bit flaky. And he bought his lot for speculation. He wasn't going to build on it. You and I have a house, his is bare, and he stops paying his taxes. Guess who gets to pay his assessment? You and me. What's that going to do for sales of lots in a town like that? Because the Mattoon Act mainly applied to unincorporated communities, right? And Town of Temple is not incorporated. So I found a former boss of mine found a document that said there were 968 of the original 1,300 lots sold in the first couple of years. In 2 years, they sold 7. 7 lots in 2 years after this got passed. Now, you can't make a connection between the two directly, but it just seems likely that this had a big impact. And people say, wait a minute, well, I want to buy a property where, a flaky guy might not pay his assessment. I'm like, for you in particular, right? And so the financial problems get to the point where, and again, it goes back to the oil thing too. Temple's pouring money into oil development. He's pouring money into real estate. And out here, he's building a mansion for himself that is costing more and more money and taking him 5 years to build. And so it's time to start, by the end of 1925, this is 2 years roughly after the town gets started, they're taking out bonds. Because they got to find a way to restructure their financing so they can hope they can make this thing work. So they take out $550,000 in bonds through a couple of big companies, Stax and Marble, which were really big firms. They were legitimate bond houses. And they probably thought, this is a good thing for us, because if there's a default, we'll probably still have something valuable in the future to be able to make some of our money from. But in any case, on the left is the minute book saying we're going to take these bonds out, and on the right is an advertisement in a newspaper from early 1926, where you could buy bonds to invest in the community. It really didn't help. This is an article in the LA Times in 1926. Temple forges into limelight. And so the distinction between news and advertising is not a new problem, where what you read like a news article is actually advertising. But they're having the photos of the community. There's the church, and there's the park. In fact, that's the same view I think we saw earlier, and all of that. And they're trying to really promote this, and they're still having trouble being able to make this work. Advertising picks up again. And see on the bottom left there, that's what they're trying to convince people that you can have a little chicken coop back there, and raise your chickens, get the egg, you can make enough money to make that self-sustaining, and what have you. And it's a model house. But again, a lot of these were built by the company. They would build model homes and then hope people would want to buy those. Notice the sprinkler system. That's kind of a new thing back then, right? Having sprinklers on your lawn and all of that. Valid race restrictions. I'd love to know what invalid race restrictions are. That's an interesting phrasing there. But they're talking about all the things you can have. Cheap water, we've got a post office and a bank. Everybody goes to that whole point about things you can have in your community to make it look like it's doing really well. But again, he's got oil wells. Now the Montebello was his main source of income. And Montebello was a shallow field. In other words, it didn't have the deep wells you would find in Signal Hill or Santa Fe Springs or Huntington Beach. And so he made a ton of money in the first 3 or 4 years, and then we can see it in some of the documents we have in the collection. The production goes down and down, and his revenue goes down. So here's the oil production doing this, and here's his real estate expenses going like this. This house that we have here, 5 years of construction. They had a big celebration in 1928 after it was finished, but he was already in trouble with it. He had to mortgage this to finish paying for it. And the mortgage is due October 29th, 1929. You know what happened that day in New York City?
Oh, yeah.
The stock market crashed. And he's still building things. So the Edison building, which is still standing at 3rd and Main in Alhambra, northwest corner, that was his last major project. That was finished in spring of 1927. So if we get to the end of the 20s, it's not looking good at all. And then somebody says, you know what, the name of Temple's got to change. And the reasons for that, as it says here, was, well, in San Francisco County, you've got Templeton. And there's Temple Street in Los Angeles. And there's the Angeles Temple of Amy Temple McPherson. So we need a new name, and they had a contest. And it was done by the Chamber of Commerce. And There was a guy named John Daggett on KHJ. He was a very popular DJ kind of personality. Uncle John, they called him. He was on there. John Stephen McGroarty of the Mission Play, he was the author of that. Close friend of Walter Temple's, actually. They were the judges. And they got a few hundred submissions, and the winner was Santa Rita. So that could have been the name of Temple City. Except, somebody didn't like it. And so I think Walter Temple told his, he hired a historian to write the history of the Workman and Temple families. The guy was under his employment for 10 years and never got anything done. Partly because Temple kept sending him off to do other things. Like, this is a draft letter to the editor of the Temple Times, which I think is still on microfilm at the county library in town. I went through it years ago. And this is a guy named Perry Wharton. And Wharton was fussy. That's the best way to put it. He wrote in very strange ways. This is not actually a good example. He would capitalize things. He was like a texter today. He would capitalize and underline and 9,000 exclamation points at the end of the sentence and all that. But if you can see it, he just says, as a reader of your wide-awake newspaper, my attention has been called to the movement to change the name of Temple. And he goes on to say, well, if you study California history and you talk about the pioneers, the native daughters of California, and all of that, Temple Street, this is really a bad idea. You shouldn't change the name. And they didn't change it. They actually went back and decided that Santa Rita was not going to work. So I think Temple probably got that done through an agent of his to complain enough to get that done. So finally, in October or September 1928, the Postal Service decided Temple City was okay with them, and that's how it officially got done. Although before that, you had advertisements where people were starting to use this. This is for Thanksgiving, obviously, but this guy I think was around before that. Get your homegrown turkeys right at the end of town there on that city. So that's where Temple City's name came along. It's late 20s. And then another idea was, we're really floundering on sales. Temple Townsite Company was selling on their own because they had gotten rid of Marsh and Coren and Berry before. And they found a company called Davis Baker, which was a Pasadena firm, very successful. They had, I think, maybe 30 subdivisions that they managed in the 1920s, very successful ones. The problem is that when I looked in the newspapers, you find their ads for Pasadena, quarter page with their logo and nice graphics and all that. This is what they put out for Town of Temple. I don't think they were given enough money to take out nice ads. This was about it. And this is not very attractive. Your eye's not going to be drawn to that. It's like every other want ad in the paper, And so that was kind of a problem. This is 1928, and it really didn't succeed as well. Now, about 30 years ago, my wife and I were in Catalina Island on vacation, and we walked by a little business building, and on the door it said Davis Baker Company. And it was a Sunday, and they were closed. So when I got back home, I called, and somebody answered, and it was the son of Davis.
Okay.
And he said, yeah. He said, my dad and his partner had this company in Pasadena. He said, I inherited it. I'm just here in Catalina. I do a few rentals and all that. And when I asked if they had any records left, he said, no, it all got thrown away years ago, which is typically what happened. But that would have been fun to see if they had anything. This is a good example, 1927. It's a statement of assets and liabilities. When your assets say on the bottom, $800,000 or whatever it is. No, pardon, $1,013,000 in assets. But a lot of them are going to be, mortgages that are due to you from other people, And your assets, first mortgages of $330,000. Well, that's just a mortgage. It doesn't mean you're going to realize anything from it. But you look at the cash in the bank, $1,000. That's all I had, is $1,000 in the bank? Does that sound good to you? Yeah. And then the liabilities. So they have their obligations to the trust because they had taken out all these bonds. And this is 1927. They added more in 1929. They added $300,000 there. They were starting to get worried about what was going on. So yes, the assets look good. The liabilities are half that, but it's not really the mix you think it is. That's the wonder of creative accounting and bookkeeping. Right? It got so bad that in April 1928, Temple's attorney, Woodruff, and his business partner, he was invested in this too, wrote him a long letter saying, you met 2 weeks ago, and I suggested that you give up half of the Montebello oil field to save the Workman Homestead Ranch, which is here. And here's how we're going to do it. He goes through, he did this several times. He had some really creative ideas about how to get some financing from some trusts and some other things to do this. But it shows you how bad things were. This is 1928. This is not stock market related. This is purely doing too much too soon. And so they were really kind of on the edge. And so in 1929, they decided that they were going to borrow $2,500 from a mortgage company. That's it? What's that going to do for you? There was one from 1931 where it said, Milton Kaufman's going to sell the company's Dodge sedan and apply the proceeds towards the town. That's how bad things got. And I think I mentioned before that the minute book is missing 1926 to 29. It's just gone. So you can only pick up the story towards the end. This is 1931, actually. And they're talking about a way to, again, try to deal with their problems because they had a creditor, a guy named Church, who was a banker from South Pasadena and Highland Park in Los Angeles. And he had taken a lot of the company debt on. And so they were trying to figure out how to help him out. And in the same document, Woodruff and Dupuy basically say, we're out. You've got to release us from any financial obligation for this. So it's the heart of the Depression. Not a good time to be dealing with it. So this is the Temple Times from May 1930. On the top right here, Temple Townsite sells to Corinth. So the guy they had fired 5 years before, they had to bring him back in and sell all of their interests to him. In May 1930, Walter Temple had moved from the homestead here just a month before, and he went to Ensenada in Baja California, which was kind of an American enclave. Ensenada was not really a Mexican town to speak of. It was kind of a European-American thing. But he moved down there. And now Americans live in Baja droves, right? He was kind of a pioneer, if you want to put it that way, in terms of living down on the cheap, because he was trying to find a way to cut back on expenses. And so he's down there, but the company continued to exist because it had to still try to manage its debt through the 1930s. So this is a March 1930 view, beautiful shot, obviously, of the snow-capped San Gabriel back there. And you're further south of Temple City Boulevard, looking up towards Las Tunas. So like you said, this building's still there. I think both of these might still be there, and then in the corners as well. But it's time to bow out. And so Walter, as I said, moves to Baja. He lived there for a couple of years. He was in Tijuana for a bit. Then he went to San Diego. And then he had cancer, so he moved back to Los Angeles. He lived in a house in back of the house of his girlfriend's family. So kind of like an ADU. In the Lincoln Heights area of Los Angeles. So when he died in 1938, he was plumb broke, had really nothing left. But that's not an unusual story. A lot of people went through this. You know, when you're a speculator, it doesn't work out, and you could be totally wiped out. He was just one of many. And you know, it's kind of a symbol or an example of what the Roaring Twenties was about. We have this periodically, right? 1987, 2008, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Do you think a lot of this taking on so much growth or trying to expand so quickly was greed?
Yeah, sure. It's greed to the extent that you want to make hay while the sun shines, if the opportunities are there. One thing I didn't mention before, so I should have. 1923 was the peak year of the boom in Los Angeles that started after World War I. It was the peak. So that's the problem. It's like buy low, sell high. They bought high and they didn't sell, actually, just lost it. But it was a kind of bad timing. So yes, you want to make as much money as possible when you're coming into something. But it was bad timing, the wrong contractors, and all the things that we talked about today. So it was just a perfect storm of terrible things that happened.
He's buried here.
Walter, when he died in 1938, the family came to the California Bank, which owned the homestead at the time. And they asked permission for him to be buried here. The bank said no. We want to keep the cemetery open for anybody else who may be, buying the property subsequent to that. So he was buried at San Gabriel, Michigan. The family bought a plot in the old cemetery out there. But in 2002, his granddaughter, Josette Temple, who just passed away a couple years ago, and a lot of things from her estate were used today. She paid for and spent all the time getting them moved here. It was a lot of work that she did. But we did have a ceremony in 2002 where we had a tour out there. Yeah. All right, very quickly, I just want to mention to you we have an upcoming event. We're going to talk about the Workman Temple families as a whole in the 1920s, including Temple City and other things too. That'll be April 16th, so if you are free that day, please come back and join us at 2 o'clock for that. I'll also mention we have a book club, so we're talking about sports right now. And the 1936 Olympics will be the topic of that one on March the 3rd. Edmund Rodman, who is a journalist, award-winning journalist, Jewish Journal was his most recent gig here. He's an independent now. He is an avid collector of Los Angeles' Jewish history, and he'll be talking about that on Sunday, March the 12th at 2 o'clock. And then the week after that, we're having a presentation by, her name, I just forgot the name. Anyway, Natalie Meyer, there it is. Natalie is an expert on women's, well, clothing in general, but women's and men's, especially the Victorian era. So she's going to talk on March 19th during Women's History Month about changing fashions for women at 2 o'clock. We already have 65 people signed up for that, so if you want to do that, make a reservation, because it's proving to be very popular. It's awesome. And you can sign up for events at homesteadmuseum.org/upcoming events with a slash in the middle. And that's our handle at Homestead Museum on Facebook and Instagram. So keep these things in mind. All right, with that, I'll wrap it up. And if you have any questions, we happy to answer them. But thank you for coming out today.
The plaque, the original mission site, is it still there? Is it long gone?
It is still there. And for a long time, it's in a location that's very isolated.
Okay.
It's on the very northeastern corner of the city of Montebello at San Gabriel Boulevard in Lincoln, west of Roseby. And for a long time, it was just kind of sitting out there, ignored. But the city actually, they must have got a grant. They did a beautiful landscaping job, and there's paved sidewalks and drought-tolerant plants. It looks really nice now, at least last time I saw it. But it is still there. It's not the original site because Temple happened to own that piece of property. It was across San Gabriel Boulevard to the north. The original site, probably, but it's out there. So if you go out there, don't think that Mission was right there at the bottom of the hill, because they couldn't build a whole Mission at the bottom of the hill. But close enough. Anybody else? Gary?
Is there a centennial celebration in Temple City, or is next weekend?
Well, the Committee Festival is an ongoing thing that they do. I've been kind of talking to some people over there about doing some stuff more this year, so we'll see what comes out of that.
September 24th, you said is when they had the first anniversary.
We'll have the barbecue, yeah, so it could be September, it could be May.
Do you want to write in for being Grand Marshal?
Yeah. They asked me to go next weekend, but I couldn't. I got something here that day. But we'll have Temple family show up. Hey, Jerry.
In May, there will be a 100-year celebration. I think it's May 23rd.
May 23rd, good. Okay.
Somewhere around there.
All right.
May 28th. I'm not sure what date, but
At
there
the
will
park?
be a big celebration.
Something official.
Yes.
Will
At
it be
the
at the
park?
park, Jerry?
Pardon me?
Will it be at the park?
That's unknown yet, but most likely, yes. Temple City Park.
By the way, Jerry's recording this. He is a safety. You're the official photographer for the city, is that right?
Yes.
And so this will be posted on his website, on our YouTube channel as well. So if you want to see it again, share it with people, whatever it may be. We'll get the details worked out. But Jerry says he'll have this edited pretty quickly. Sounds like.
Yep.
That'd be awesome. Okay. Any other questions? Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.